Funding for Current Conversations is provided by University of Oklahoma President's Office, University of Oklahoma Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis-Indiano. Today we're going to be visiting with Dr. Alan E. Wilson, a professor and aquatic ecologist at Auburn University. We're going to be talking about the environmental crisis, the public response to it, and Dr. Wilson's own work. Join us for this fascinating conversation. Dr. Alan Wilson, thank you for being on the show. It is great to have you here.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Okay, a lot of great questions about the environment. Would you start us off talking about the big picture of what people mean what scientists mean when they say environmental crisis? What are we talking about?
So these are going to be the main issues that are going to be affecting human populations around the world, global crises. And again, I study lakes, and so water is fundamental to lakes. And so making sure that people have access to safe drinking water is a major problem across the world. But there are lots of different kinds of environmental crises. Making sure people have food, just fundamental needs that need to be met.
As a scientist, does it throw you off or surprise you that when you and others talk about environmental crises, and we'll get down to some specifics in a minute, that sometimes people just aren't interested? I mean, millions of people are not interested, or working out of no base of information at all, they'll just say, well, we don't think there is such a thing. There's no crisis. Scientists are making that up. How do you respond when you hear that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think there's multiple reasons. I think we need to get more kids excited about science. We need to have better training, K through 12, college. We need to get more people interested in being scientists, so we have educated people training our youth in science, technology, engineering, and math fields. And there's a big push now through multiple groups to try to encourage more interest in science. And I also think that the attention span of people is ever shrinking. And so I think that people if they can't read it on their cell phone quickly, then they're just not interested. So I think it's hard to capture people's attention at some level.
Is this something that worries you, or maybe you and colleagues? I mean, I can't think of another time that I've read about in history. There was starting to be a little bit of science in the Middle Ages, but it was not part of the culture. People really didn't pay any attention to science. And in the Renaissance, there was a lot of interest in science. So here we are back again, as if we've gone back to the Middle Ages, where people are just saying, I know better. I may not know anything, but I know better. I mean, do the implications of that keep you awake at night a little bit? Or
we only have so much control over factors that are affecting our whole world. So, but I think we all can make a difference. And so I think as an educator, my job is to excite people about science and to make them aware of problems that are out there. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities, but we need to take hold of those. And I think today our conversation is part of that, to let people know about some crises that are out there in the environment.
One of my favorite science fiction novels is by a physicist, Gregory Benford, from 1980. It's called Timescape, and it's about algal blooms, algae in just huge amounts, poisoning the oceans, and the world's about to die. And that's really the premise of the book. That pretty much leads into your research, isn't that right?
Absolutely, and I think we're there. So I think that, and these events maybe were happening at that time, but there's a lot of people around the world that are studying algal blooms, and clearly the water, not only marine systems, but freshwater systems are plagued by harmful algal blooms, and it's a reality that we're facing right now.
Okay, now my guess is that most people hearing you right now hear the words, okay, it's a reality, but they don't know what that reality is. I mean, let's start off with some simple things I need to hear answers to. What is algae, for example? Isn't that a pretty large term?
Yeah, so these are going to be the tiny plants, the tiny primary producers. So when we go walk in our backyard, we see grass, those are primary producers. But in lakes and oceans, we have tiny little plants. In some cases, they're kind of half bacteria, half plants, called cyanobacteria. But these are the primary producers. They photosynthesize, they're taking the sunlight, and they're making energy. And so everything that's not a primary producer they have to eat something else to get the energy they need to grow.
So what people kind of register in around lakes and oceans and so on boats is a kind of sometimes a green, kind of scummy,
Yeah,
sticky stuff. That's the algae.
that can be. There's a lot of different
It's a
types of
really
algae.
broad umbrella. There's a lot of
Huge
different
diversity. Huge
life,
diversity.
vegetative life forms that go under algae. Right?
That's correct. And they come in many different sizes and shapes and colors, but they're typically microscopic. But when you can see them at what you described, that usually means there's a problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's an algal bloom, and why do we need to care about it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I've studied algal blooms for 15 years now, and it's a question that I still struggle to answer because when I see an algal bloom, I kind of know this is an algal bloom, but sometimes it's not as obvious. And so when you see these scums, those are usually indicative of an algal bloom. But some of these algae can float, and so they could potentially, they may not be as concentrated throughout the whole water column, but they just happen to be at the surface, so they're more obvious. But there may be situations where there's lots of algae underneath the surface, but you can't see them. And so, different agencies have different metrics they use to define when is an algal bloom. An algal bloom, again, it could depend on the transparency, how easily you can see into the water. But I study a lot of systems where it's very clear there's an algal bloom. You could almost walk on the water.
Okay, so there's always algae there, but when you've got a bloom, somehow it's gotten out of control. And in the novel I'm speaking of, the oceans actually turn red and brown because these algal blooms go on for miles, hundreds of miles. It's just a really big deal. Why is that a bad thing?
Good. Yeah, and so these red algal blooms that you're describing, they happen every year in Florida called red tides, and it's a particular kind of algae, a dinoflagellate, that's actually red in color and creates these sheaths or these blooms, these scums in the ocean. But they're bad. There's a variety of reasons, but some of these algae can produce toxins that can kill fish and kill your pet. In some cases, they can actually kill people, and so they disrupt the whole food web. And so you have lots of algae. It may not be good algae, it may not be healthy algae. Things can't eat it, and then so the energy is not moving up the food chain, and so all these things that rely on that energy source can't use it. And then there's other issues which can be related to fish kills that the algae themselves may not cause. So there's non-toxic algae can cause these events, but it's not necessarily the algae, it's the microbial community that's degrading the algae that actually is removing the oxygen from the water, creating an anoxic, a no oxygen zone. And then the fish that need oxygen and the other organisms, they die because they don't have the oxygen they need.
Normally, the algae would produce oxygen, and that they help to oxygenate the oceans and the waters that they're. So in their normal numbers, they're just part of a ladder of life, all the way up to bigger, fish like sharks and so on. But when they get out of control, they become neurotoxins. They're poisoning the water on a massive scale.
They can, and so not all taxa produce toxins. In some cases, some that don't, and so there's a lot of work that's being done trying to figure out exactly what causes these algae that could produce toxins to produce toxins. But what you're describing is often the case, is that they become too dense, too abundant, and it disrupts the whole community, and so that the food, everything just kind of falls apart.
I'm also getting from what you're saying that phytoplankton.
Algae, right?
Algae, is a sort of like the grass of the oceans. And I mean, just about every ladder of life will come back to them in some way, right? In that environment. So if they're poisoned, if that's a problem, it could theoretically, as in that novel Timescape, threaten the Earth, right?
For sure, absolutely,
Okay.
yeah. And so, absolutely. So that the phytoplankton, and I try to make this argument with my colleagues that study fish because they forget that those fish depend on things, but they depend on the little animals that eat the algae. But that algae is fundamentally the important link that connects the sun and carbon dioxide to everything else. Because without the algae, then everything would fall apart.
So people may not know about this connection. It's not something they're going to readily observe in the world around them. But if this went bad, in that catastrophic novel, a kind of dystopian novel, it would really be a problem. Trophic cascade. I think that's the other concept we might need here. What is that?
Yeah, so this is an interesting kind of concept that was developed with lake ecology research, and this is the idea that you have this set of interactions, and I like to use large fish eating little fish,
Yeah.
and so you have these big fish that eat little fish. Those little fish eat little zooplankton. These are little animals that those eat phytoplankton. So you could think of a four-leveled system. And the trophic cascade is actually the effect of those fish through the zooplankton on the algae. And so it's not a direct interaction, but it's how those fish affect the algae through the zooplankton. And so the idea is that if there's a lot of big fish, they eat all the little fish, meaning that there's no little fish to eat the zooplankton, meaning that there's a lot of zooplankton to eat the algae. And so if you remove those big fish, which people like to catch big fish and take them home, then there's lots of little fish eat a lot of the zooplankton, and there's nothing to graze down the algae. And so then you have situations where there's lots of algae. So it's a series of interactions, but it's typically it's two links up and how that
Right.
affects the base of the food web.
That is a great explanation. It really helps. I think this is a missing piece for a lot of people. They don't understand how a problem with algae connects to them. But you're saying that there's a kind of balance in a life ladder, everything eating the thing below it, and that if that gets thrown off in some way, one of those steps, probably with the algae and phytoplankton, could just go out of control, and we're back to poisoning the earth again.
Potentially, of course, yeah, and right, yes.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand this. What could throw off that life ladder? Would if the temperature changes, more nutrients in the water? I mean, what all of the above? What would,
So all those would have an impact. So if as you increase the temperature, metabolism increases, the algae will grow faster. And there's going to be lethal limits, but everyone's going to be moving because they're all going to be cold-blooded creatures. So they're going to be growing faster, needing more resources. If you add nutrients, called eutrophication, you promote production that produces more phytoplankton, which in some cases is what you want because the phytoplankton will feed the zooplankton. And so in some cases, you'll fertilize to promote fishing because you need algae and you need zooplankton so you can feed the system. It just, managing lakes is tricky. And so trying to have a perfect balance to what you want is hard. And so honestly, I get a lot of people want help to guide their lake management. And I always ask them, what do you want your lake to do? And if you want a lake to go swimming in, that would be very different than a lake to go fishing in, at least in most cases. Like a lake that'd be very productive for fishing may not be a lake you want to go swimming in.
so okay, I think I need the mental picture here. So I'm seeing a stairway or maybe a ladder, and then a life form at every rung on that stair. And I think you're saying that you can change variables like the temperature, you can put more nutrients in the water, and within certain limits, the whole system is going to adjust. You push beyond what the system can do to adjust, you're going to get an imbalance, and you're back to poisoning the water.
Potentially, yeah.
Something like that. Okay.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a simplistic version. That's great. I mean, I like the latter idea, but I do think that there's a lot of complexities, and so we talk about these ladders, but the reality is that they're food webs, and so you have organisms that don't clearly fit on one rung or the other, right?
Yeah.
So they may function in different roles, and
In other words, there might be simple ladders in some environments, but in others, something that eats the thing below it could also eat something else. And so there might be an adjustment possible. We won't get a big algae bloom just because the sharks are taken out of the water. But in other environments, you could get that
for sure.
out of control.
Yeah.
Would you talk about your work and because your work just zeroes in on this kind of thing, right?
Right.
How did you get into this?
Yeah, so so I was interested in fish. So I got my master's at Michigan State, and I really wanted to study fish. And I went there, started working with fish, and realized that I was more interested in phytoplankton, so the algae. And I happened to start studying cyanobacteria. This is it's a prokaryotic alga, that group of algae.
What does prokaryotic mean?
They are single-celled organisms, very
Okay.
simple, but very
Okay.
kind of ancient organisms. But these are the ones in some cases that can produce toxins. And so it was a good system to study. And I was looking at interactions between zebra mussels, which have kind of invaded the Great Lakes and kind of invaded other areas of the Midwest, and the interaction between zebra mussels and a cyanobacterium, microcystis. And it was fascinating to study this interaction between those two. And then when I went to do my PhD, it just kind of stuck with me. And so I study the interactions between the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, so those little animals that eat the algae, and what factors, both ecological and evolutionary, affect those relationships between those algae. Because we've talked about toxic algae, but some of the work that my lab does shows how some zooplankton of the same species don't see the toxins as being toxic. So toxic algae don't exist to them like it would another of the same species. And again, looking at humans, we're different.
So there could be kind of an automatic self-adjustment within the system because some zooalgae can deal with the toxins better, tolerate them better,
Yes, that's right.
and remove them. from the water.
Well, I'd like to tell you we know how they do it, but they somehow eat the algae that some others of the same species can't eat, and it's fascinating.
I think somebody was doing PR for your bacteria from cyanobacteria because the line I read somewhere was, "This is the cyanobacteria are the most successful life form on the earth." Now, why would somebody say that?
Well, they've been around a long time. In some cases, people argue they were the first on the planet, so they're the ones that kind of set the stage for everything else. So they've been around for 3 billion years, and they're in every system. So not only in freshwater, marine systems, they're on land, they're everywhere. So they're I would say that's the right assessment. They're everywhere.
So far we've been talking about algal blooms as an obvious problem, sort of negative side of this. But isn't there a whole other side where we could be talking about algae as potential food sources for us, sources of fuel? They could be used to clean up the environment in ways that we can't do mechanically. Isn't there a whole other world?
For sure, yeah. So not all algal blooms are bad, and so a lot of times I talk to people who automatically want to treat a pond that's green, and I think the message I try to give to lake owners and the water resource managers that not all green is bad, and that there's a lot of good, there's a lot of utility in algae, but not all algae is what you want to have in your system.
Now, isn't your work also involved with introducing certain life forms that could help the system to auto-adjust? Like, isn't there I think it's called water flea, Daphnia? What's the story there?
Yeah, so this is a type of zooplankton. They're fairly
Okay.
large relative to most zooplankton because all these are microscopic creatures. So when we talk about the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, those tend to be things you can't really see well unless you have a microscope. But Daphnia tend to be fairly large, and they're crustaceans, kind of like shrimp, but they look more like fleas than anything. And so they do have this generic name of water flea. So we study a particular species, and we take Daphnia from different environments. Some cases that have toxic green, disgusting systems versus pure kind of clear lakes. And we take those same species, but different genotypes, and we can kind of compete those. And we see that the ones that have been adapted to these toxic environments, they're not afraid of the toxins. And it makes sense, right? Because they're still there. They've somehow figured out a way to get over this toxic hump. Where the ones that are naive to toxic algae, they really struggle. And
So they're going to reduce the numbers of the toxic algae.
they are remarkable. So we have systems where you put these in and give them a few weeks, and where you have these resistant Daphnia, they eat everything. It's perfectly clear. And the ones where they can't eat that toxic algae, it's a scum.
Well, I mean, if you couldn't introduce these water fleas, Daphnia, what would you do? Would you have to use herbicides or something to try to? And then you've got unintended consequences possibly with that. So this could be a really good way to keep the environment, manipulate the environment so it stays healthy with these Daphnia.
So it's one approach. So there's a lot. So you talked
Right.
about herbicides. So copper sulfate is a common one. So people will use that, and it's very effective. Copper kills a lot of things, but I'm sure it kills other things. Some people will use dye to kind of limit the amount of light that gets into a lake. Daphnia is one approach. Again, adding species to different systems that may not be there is not ideal. It's not perfect for every system, and there's some unique features of lakes that you need for Daphnia to be successful. Because in shallow systems, Daphnia won't do well because they're pretty big and kind of slow, and so fish will eat them. And small fish love Daphnia. And so we talked about the trophic cascade. And so if you put Daphnia in a system with little fish, the Daphnia go away. And so the Daphnia need a home and kind of an escape place. And so you have to have a system where the Daphnia cannot be eaten. And not every system has that set up.
Alan, is all of this sort of cranked up to a little higher level of urgency? And I'm just asking because I don't know, because of global warming. I mean, does that create an element of, say, warmer environment for algae, where algal blooms could be more likely? So we need to find ways where we understand the outcomes to actually trim those back. If the Earth's going to get warmer, we need to control that system so we don't poison ourselves to death. Is that accurate or not?
That's absolutely accurate. And there's a lot of concern now because I think the data are fairly clear that we're kind of in a state of emergency with our globe, and people have a huge impact on a lot of things on the planet. And so cyanobacteria tend to do well when it's warm. So this is kind of a scary feature, is that they do well with high nutrients and high temperatures, which is the tendency of where we're going with our water resources. And if this is true, then these algal blooms will become more frequent, more intense.
So one thing people might remember from this conversation is they may not see the immediate results of global warming in their own sink or their bathroom or whatever. But these trophic cascades, once they start, it really will reach into their home at some point, and they're going to have problems with water that's polluted and toxic.
We are here at the Pickaway Correctional Institution, where state prison officials say tens of thousands of gallons of water will be going from this prison all the way up to families in the Toledo area. We're told that water is going to come from the state prison system's water treatment plant. It's that building back there straight behind us that we are zooming in on right now. That water is set to be hauled away from here in just about an hour from now. Now, overnight, we have been following these developments very closely for you. Toledo's mayor said that tests done by state and federal authorities, well, they indicated an improved water quality, but additional testing, he says, is still needed. City officials warned families not to use the city drinking water early Saturday after tests at one treatment plant showed increased levels of a toxin, most likely from algae, now on Lake Erie. Families told not to drink, brush their teeth, or wash dishes with that water have been using truckloads of bottled water delivered from all over the state over the weekend. The Ohio National Guard is on hand there right now this morning that is using water purification.
Lake Erie has a pretty regular algal bloom in the Western Basin, and in August 2014, the city had to shut down drinking water access because they had toxins and for 500,000 people were without drinking water for 3 days, which is a huge deal. And I think it really put algal blooms on the map. And so I think there's going to be a lot more awareness. And so I would encourage all of your viewers, next time they're driving down the road, pay attention to the lakes on the side that they're driving by, because a lot of times you'll see green ponds, green reservoirs.
Don't drink out of those.
I would not drink it. I would not let my dog swim in those or my kids play in them. Yeah.
The situation I'm wondering if this maybe keeps you and some of your colleagues up at night. You all have a pretty clear focus on all this. But you know, and I know, there are millions of people out there who've effectively crossed their arms and said, I don't need to know about this. I'm sure it's not happening. I don't know anything about any of this, but I'm sure it's not happening. That's a really dangerous situation, isn't it? I mean, if folks are not willing to act and support the kinds of changes you're talking about, we could be in a fix, right?
Yes, it's hard to believe that with the number of people that we have on the planet that we're not having some effect. And again, it's if you don't pay attention to the data, and I think as scientists we need to do a better job getting the message out in a way that everyone can understand. But it's hard to believe that we have a huge number of people and that we have such an impact on our natural resources that we're not having an impact. And so, so personally, it's hard for me to believe anyone would not think that. But I think a lot of people just they don't. And I hope that part of a product of our conversation is that more people will be thinking about their water resources and they'll appreciate them. And I think we take it for granted that we can hit a switch, and many of us, and we have safe water to drink. And there's a lot of places around the world where that's not true.
No. And you're doing really valuable work finding ways to keep the water clean and keep it from being toxic, that where we do know the outcomes and it's not really dangerous. It sounds like the major problem here is the lack of support of the millions of people that don't want to pay the taxes, don't want to support the politicians, that want to act on the problems that you're talking about, that are supporting the others that say, no, I haven't seen it myself, so I don't think it's happening. It sounds like this is a people problem.
I just think it has to happen in your backyard, and then it becomes your problem. And sadly, I think Toledo really got a lot of people to be more aware of algal blooms. And as much as I'm sad that event happened, I think more people are taking this seriously. And
it sounds like there needs to be some kind of proactive effort from, a nonprofit or somebody to get this word out. I mean, you're a great explainer. You got me scared. I hear what you have to say, and I'm concerned about this. And if that were communicated to more people, it sounds like people would be more willing to act and maybe to pay a little bit to solve these problems.
Well, I mean, part of me being here is to try to spread the word. So I'm trying my best to make sure people are aware of these situations.
We talked about this a little bit earlier. Are you concerned that this sort of people turning their back on the prestige and the importance of science is a little bit like they're turning their back on facts about politicians or anything else, a kind of drift away from information-based decision-making where people go with what feels good, what's convenient to them? You know what I'm saying? It's really inconvenient to think about what you're bringing up.
It is, and I think a lot of people, they would trust their neighbor or their Facebook friend more than they trust the experts. But I think it's our job as scientists to spread our knowledge in a way that people can understand it. So again, I don't want to take all the blame, but I think that all of us, all scientists, need to do a better job making sure that we're sharing our knowledge. And again, me being here is part of this.
Okay, fearless forecast time. I want you to look in your crystal ball into the future and tell us something that's maybe 10, 20 years down the road that may have to do with the response to the environmental crisis or something about the environmental crisis. You pick, and we will put a note on our calendars and check 10 or 20 years down the road and see if it came true.
Okay, well, I think it's a great question, and sadly, I think we're already there. So I don't think we need to look that far into the future. I think we already know that our water resources are super important, but they're being compromised by a number of things. And so the algal blooms that we talked about earlier, I think, are reality. They're happening now. I think as more people become more aware of it, and more people are studying, more resources are going into learning about these, we're going to see that they're happening in places we didn't think they were happening. So, for example, a study just came out recently looking at algal blooms or toxins that are produced by algae in streams. And now there's a lot that kind of is strange about that, but these algae typically don't do well in flowing systems. So to think that streams that could be producing water or being a source of water for drinking could have toxic algae. Right. Yeah.
So there could be something dramatic in the future where there's an algal bloom that just gets way out of control, either in the oceans or streams or whatever, and we feel the impact of it. And you're basically predicting that's going to wake us up.
So 2014, it happened. It'll happen again. So I guess it won't take 20 years to happen. So there'll be another Toledo. And again, I don't want folks in Toledo to be I don't want them to be upset with me. But if it's not Toledo, it will happen somewhere else.
Okay. Dr. Alan Wilson, thank you very much for being here with us today. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next time for more current conversation. Thank you for watching.